Arrogant millionaire throws water at a homeless girl. Later, he regrets it bitterly. Lucas Marshall, the self-proclaimed king of luxury, was about to experience a reality check, and it wasn't going to involve a concierge, room service, or a heated towel rack. Imagine this. Lucas in his designer suit strolling down the street with the kind of swagger that could make a peacock jealous. He was the type of millionaire who believed his success had granted him immunity from anything resembling a hard day's work, or common sense. If there was a red carpet, Lucas would walk on it. If there was a problem, Lucas would pay someone else to fix it. He had money, he had power, and most importantly, he had a lot of attitude. But on this particular day, Lucas was about to learn the hard way that life doesn't always roll out the red carpet. Oh no. Today, Lucas Marshall was about to toss a cup of water at a homeless girl, and the universe was preparing a not-so-luxurious lesson in humility. Lucas Marshall had it all: a penthouse, a personal chef who could pronounce ingredients no one had ever heard of, and an ego that could have its own zip code. His days were filled with sipping espresso in high-end cafes, arguing with his assistant over trivial details, like which shade of gold was classier, and sneering at anything less than 5 stars. Lucas believed the world was his oyster and he was the pearl, shiny, flawless, and undeniably important. But there was one thing Lucas never saw coming. Daisy. Daisy wasn't a millionaire. She didn't have a fancy wardrobe, a sparkling necklace, or even shoes that were currently in fashion. What she did have was rugged determination, sharp wit, and an unshakable sense of humor. Daisy was homeless, but if you asked her, she'd tell you it wasn't her identity. It was just her current location. She was a master at navigating the streets, her little corner of the world, with more grace and purpose than most people with a full-time job. Her world and Lucas's world were as different as night and day, but somehow those two worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected and hilarious way. It all started when Lucas, after a particularly self-congratulatory brunch, which was really just a look-at-me session with a few high-profile clients, decided to take a walk. His stomach was full of overpriced avocado toast, his head was buzzing with thoughts of his next big investment, and his Instagram feed was desperately begging for a picture. He figured a walk in the park would be the perfect way to show off just how spontaneous and grounded he was. That's when he saw Daisy, sitting casually on a park bench with a well-worn notebook in hand. She was scribbling something, her focus intense, probably writing down her thoughts, ideas, or maybe even a poem about the city's chaos. Lucas, who had never once considered sitting down on a park bench unless it was to make a dramatic point, stopped in his tracks. He could have kept walking. He could have let her blend into the background of the city, which was exactly where he thought people like her belonged. But instead, an idea popped into his head, one that seemed as brilliant as it was ridiculous. You see, Lucas had recently made a bet with his friend, one of those silly you won't dare kinds of challenges. The bet was simple. Do something completely out of character, something that would make everyone go, "Wait, what just happened?" Well, Lucas decided that tossing a cup of water at a homeless girl was the perfect way to meet the challenge. She was sitting there looking so unaware of who he was, and it just felt right. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of it. Maybe it was the idea of getting away with something wild. Either way, he was about to make a choice that would lead him down a path he could never have imagined. With a grin creeping onto his face, Lucas straightened his back. This was going to be glorious, spontaneous, wild, and most importantly, memorable. As he approached Daisy, he rehearsed what he would say in his mind. Maybe he'd throw in a witty remark like, "Did you order the deluxe water splash with a side of chaos?" He was practically salivating at the thought of how he'd be the talk of his next fancy dinner party. But the moment he took a step closer to Daisy, something unexpected happened. Daisy, who had been completely absorbed in her scribblings, suddenly looked up, right at Lucas. Their eyes locked, and for a split second Lucas felt something he wasn't used to: confusion. She wasn't looking at him in awe or surprise. She wasn't flinching or looking down in embarrassment, like most people would when he decided to grace them with his presence. No, Daisy just raised an eyebrow, looked at him like he was a minor inconvenience, probably the most normal thing he'd experienced all day, and then went back to her notebook. Lucas blinked. That was not how this was supposed to go. Lucas stammered, unsure how to proceed. He was used to being the center of attention, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was the punchline of some joke he hadn't heard yet. Daisy didn't even flinch. She scribbled some more in her notebook, clearly unbothered by the multimillionaire who was standing there, apparently debating whether or not to splash her with water. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is it just my sheer unbotheredness?" Daisy said, her voice smooth like butter. Lucas, who had been prepared for some dramatic response, probably involving gasps or an attempt to flee, stood there, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. How was this happening? This wasn't part of the plan. Was she mocking him? "Oh, no, no," Lucas said, shaking his head and trying to regain his composure. I was just thinking, I could give you a drink, something refreshing." Daisy looked up again, her eyes narrowing with an expression Lucas couldn't quite read. "A drink? You're going to offer me a drink?" she repeated slowly, the corners of her mouth curling up into a smirk. "What's next? A little moral lecture about how I'm ruining the aesthetic of your perfect day?" Lucas felt the weight of her words as if they were a punch to his pristine little bubble. The nerve of her. Here he was trying to perform a grand gesture, and she was twisting it into some kind of philosophical critique. He was about to defend himself. He really was. But then, just as he opened his mouth, Daisy stood up and glanced down at her notebook. Without missing a beat, she tossed the notebook into the air, caught it again with a theatrical flourish, and smirked. She said, "it takes a certain amount of chutzpah to try and throw water at someone who couldn't care less about your Instagram-worthy life. But," she paused dramatically, "you're going to need a little more than that if you're trying to make this an interesting story." Lucas stood there, mouth slightly agape, his carefully crafted plan unraveling faster than the sweater his grandmother knitted for him when he was 7. What was happening? He was being outwitted by a girl with no shoes and a notebook. He couldn't even fathom how this situation had become a comedic tragedy in under 5 minutes. But before he could say anything else, Daisy, unimpressed and completely unfazed, shrugged, casually walked away and muttered, "Good luck with your bet, rich boy." Lucas stood frozen for a moment, watching as Daisy nonchalantly walked off into the crowd. He couldn't believe it. That had not gone according to plan at all. Lucas stood there, still gripping his untouched glass of water, staring after Daisy as she disappeared into the crowd. A strange sensation settled in his chest, one he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something else entirely. For the first time in years, he felt insignificant. Not in the sense that his wealth, charm, or carefully cultivated image had suddenly evaporated, but because, in that brief moment, he realized that none of it had mattered to her. Daisy hadn't been impressed. She hadn't been intimidated. She hadn't even been interested in the spectacle he was trying to create. She had just dismissed him, like he was nothing more than background noise. Lucas was used to people reacting to him. They either admired him, envied him, or at the very least noticed him. But Daisy? She had walked away as if he was no more important than the pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs on the sidewalk. That realization gnawed at him. "Dude, what just happened?" Carter's voice broke through Lucas's thoughts. His friends were still standing there watching him with barely contained laughter. Did she just roast you and walk away?" Julian wheezed, shaking his head. "That was brutal." Lucas clenched his jaw, staring down at the water in his hand. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Because suddenly it wasn't about the bet anymore. It wasn't about showing off or proving a point. Now Lucas wanted to know more. Who was Daisy? And why did she seem so utterly untouchable? A new thought sparked in his mind, one that sent an unfamiliar thrill through his veins. For the first time in a long time, Lucas Montgomery had encountered something, someone he couldn't predict. And that made her the most interesting person he'd ever met. Later that evening, Lucas found himself doing something completely out of character, standing in line at a tiny food cart on the corner of 5th Street, the same food cart where Daisy had been earlier. "Man, I can't believe you dragged me here," Carter groaned, looking at the battered sign that read Joe's Famous Grilled Cheese, since 1987. Lucas ignored him. He had already spotted Daisy behind the cart, laughing with an elderly man, Joe presumably. She looked different here, relaxed, unbothered, real. As he approached, Daisy caught sight of him and arched an eyebrow. "Oh no, did your five-star chef quit? Desperate for a peasant meal?" Lucas smirked. "I hear this place has the best grilled cheese in town. Thought I'd see what all the hype was about." Daisy handed a sandwich to a customer and crossed her arms. "Uh-huh. And it has nothing to do with you getting roasted in public earlier today?" Carter snorted. "Oh, she knows." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, about that." He hesitated, then let out a chuckle. "I was a jerk. And not even an interesting one. Just a regular, predictable rich guy kind of jerk." Daisy studied him for a moment before shrugging. "I mean, yeah, but at least you're self-aware. That's new." Joe clapped Lucas on the back. "Son, let me tell you something. Humility tastes better than caviar." Lucas grinned. "Can't say I've ever tried it." Joe handed him a sandwich, and Lucas took a bite, fully expecting disappointment. Instead, his eyes widened. "Wait, this is actually incredible." Daisy smirked. "Told you." As the night went on, Lucas found himself talking to Daisy, not as Lucas Montgomery, millionaire, but just Lucas. And to his surprise, he liked it. By the time he left, he wasn't thinking about the bet anymore. He was thinking about Daisy. And for the first time in his life, he was actually excited to not be in control of what happened next. And so, ladies and gentlemen, our dear Lucas Montgomery learned a valuable lesson that night. Sometimes the richest experiences in life don't come from wealth, but from the people you least expect. Oh, and also, grilled cheese is undefeated. But we knew that already. Now tell me, have you ever been humbled in a way that completely changed your perspective? Let me know in the comments.